Too much or too little? Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives drafting 2 articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. Less is more, they say, in the hopes that a swift vote would send charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress to a trial by the Republican-controlled Senate and a vote before the first January presidential primaries. For left-wing lawmakers, it's not enough. The charges focus solely on allegations Trump withheld military aid for Ukraine in exchange for political dirt on Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden. They also wanted to include findings from former special counsel Robert Mueller's probe of Russian interference in the 2016 elections. The Russians, who, by the way, their foreign minister happens to be in Washington. More on that in a moment. But for Republicans, it's already way too much. As we'll see, they're hunkering down along partisan lines, buoyed by polls that show no dramatic shift in public opinion. That court of public opinion will soon be in session with those elections that are just around the corner. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at impeachment by Christmas. And joining us, Gloria Brown-Marshall, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the author of The Voting Rights War, the NAACP, and the Ongoing Struggle for Justice. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to welcome as well Gérald Olivier, editor of the France Amérique blog, columnist for Atlantico.fr.
With a new book coming out.
Which is called?
On the Road to the White House.
Who's on the road to the White House? Just is that a spoiler if we say it?
A bunch of people
okay.
On both sides. Due before Christmas, hopefully.
In French or in English?
In French, sorry.
In French, okay.
Sur la route de la Maison Blanche.
All right. And with us as well, Robert Parsons, our Chief International Affairs Editor, who's been following the proceedings across the Atlantic for us, the France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yet 2, not 3 articles of impeachment, and a White House that claims the president will address what it brands false charges once those proceedings do graduate to that trial before the U.S. Senate. Claire Rush has more.
Democrats have unveiled 2 articles of impeachment, or 2 formal charges against President Trump. As outlined in the House Intelligence Committee's 300-page report, one of those charges is abuse of power. Democrats accuse Trump of abusing the power of the presidency by putting personal concerns over national interests. They say Trump violated his oath of office by withholding military aid to Ukraine and a meeting with its president in a bid to pressure it to open an investigation into his Democratic rival in the 2020 election, Joe Biden. Democratic lawmakers say such an investigation had no legitimate state interest and would benefit the president personally and politically while compromising elections.
President Trump abused the power of his office by conditioning 2 official acts to get Ukraine to help his reelection. In so doing, he undermined our national security and jeopardized the integrity of our next election.
The second article of impeachment is obstruction of Congress. Democrats accuse the Trump administration of obstructing the impeachment inquiry by blocking witnesses from testifying and withholding requested documents despite several subpoenas. In a statement, the White House called the charges false and said the president expects to be fully exonerated. Under the U.S. Constitution, the president can be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
Gloria Brown-Marshall, the Democrats going about this the right way?
Procedurally, they're going about it the right way. As far as time is concerned, there's this notion that they should have waited, but they're waiting for documents that the President Trump has said are not going to come, and for witnesses he's forbidden to testify. The courts were in a situation in which they could have said, yes, these witnesses must testify, and that executive privilege does not extend to preventing them from testifying. So these he said, she said type arguments will continue, but the Democrats are going about it procedurally the way it's stated in the Constitution.
Because it is, after all, it's not like this isn't a criminal procedure, it's a political procedure.
It becomes a little bit of both. Because when you go to, for example, Nixon versus United States, and in that particular case, Richard Nixon was an unnamed co-conspirator who was accused of obstructing justice and accused of intimidating witnesses, and those are criminal acts. And so there would have been an impeachment proceeding. And even with President Clinton, there was the perjury. Perjury is a criminal issue, and it then becomes under the auspices of high crimes and misdemeanors, but it still has criminal consequences.
Would you have preferred a wider remit? The left-wing Democrats said it would have been good to include some of the elements found in the Mueller inquiry into the 2016 election and Russian meddling.
Well, that's where the political part comes in. In order to get the number of votes they needed or wanted, they decided not to include the Mueller report because there were other Democrats who wouldn't have gone along to vote for it.
But how do you feel about it?
How I feel about it, I felt that there is a need for this impeachment hearing to go forward. I would have preferred if the courts would have weighed in to demand that the witnesses testify and demand that the president turn over those subpoenaed documents in much the way that the Supreme Court ruled that Richard Nixon had to turn over the tapes.
Charles-Olivier, your thoughts on how the Democrats are moving along, again, with the idea of looking at that electoral timing?
Yeah, it's very surprising. And to me, I'm not sure they're going down the right road. It's very surprising because I think the whole process may blow up in their face. We know the outcome. They want to get rid of President Trump. They won't. Because whether they go to trial or not after the House votes for impeachment, we know how the Senate will vote. So this whole process is vain in terms of getting rid of President Trump. So from that point on, what is their point? What are they trying to do? They have a simple majority in the House, and they can take benefit from that majority and vote on those 2 articles of impeachment, very weak articles, by the way. But then they offer Donald Trump a chance to actually have a trial in the Senate, both political and criminal, as you mentioned, and during that trial to defend himself and call his own witness and put Joe Biden on trial indirectly, which is what he's trying to do, which is at the actual core of this whole procedure. So I don't understand what the Democrats are trying to gain from that process.
Should they have done nothing after that July 25th phone call?
No, after yeah. If Donald Trump had not been president, we would never have heard of such a phone call. It would never have made even back-page news. They should have folded after the Mueller report. That was the end.
But this is a different case, isn't it?
It's a different case, but he's still trying to impeach the president. For 2 years after his election, they went after him, hoping the Mueller report would give them the ammunitions to justify an impeachment, would give them reason for articles of impeachment. It failed because the 3 conclusions were no conspiracy, no obstruction of justice, no collusion. And then all of a sudden they have a new tiny pretext, a phone call.
A tiny pretext, withholding military aid from a country that's got...
It was not withheld. It was not withheld. That's how things work.
Conspiracy
That's how things work.
No, quid pro quo.
That's how things work. No, there is no quid pro quo.
There is no quid pro quo. Personal interest.
Ultimately, there was no quid pro quo.
Yes, there was.
Yes, there was. But that's how things work.
It's not how things work in the United States when it comes to personal
Vice President Biden
when it comes down to
boasted about working that way 2 years
one
before.
at a time.
Here's the thing.
No.
President Trump brought this on himself. Now, whether or not they say that people who are Democrats wanted him out of office because they didn't like the way that he conducted himself, that's one thing. But his behavior was so far outside of what this country, the United States, stands for. And I have to say, when he asked for a personal favor to investigate a rival that he believed would be the rival he would go against in the election, then I think there is a quid pro quo, and that just because the aid went through later when he found out that he had been, investigated or investigation had begun, doesn't mean that there was no quid pro quo. And going back to this issue about this happens all the time, this may happen in many ways, but it's called corruption when it does.
No, it's not.
And when you ask for a personal favor such as this, especially
It's not
for
a
an
personal
American,
favor. He was
personal
talking about the United
favor.
States. He represents the United States. He represents the United States government.
In what way?
It's not when he's the president. He's the president. He's
the
the guy in
president
the
abusing
executive
his
office.
office.
He
And he's
represents.
abusing that
He represents the United States.
he's
the
representing
commander
the
in
United
chief.
States in a
He's at the head of
corrupt-
foreign
That is the
policy.
problem, though, that he represents the
represents
United
the
States.
United
That's
States.
exactly the problem.
No,
In-
bad
in
behavior.
corruption.
Bad behavior is not an impeachable
That's
offense.
not bad behavior. That's corrupt
It's no.
behavior.
You were
and
mentioning
he's
that
using the
Democrats
White
were
House
All right,
irritated
the-
at
further
Donald
his own
Trump's
personal
persona
gain.
before.
How this is
There's
how
nothing
this
in that phone call.
how it's all playing. Let's just give you a little sample of it. This is the House Minority Leader, Republican Kevin McCarthy, and he was saying earlier, after those articles of impeachment were announced, that it's all sour grapes.
Good morning. You know, back in 2016, the Democrats called those who supported Donald Trump deplorables. And now they're trying to disqualify their votes. Democrats still cannot get over the fact that the president won the election and they lost.
Right, Paris traffic couldn't keep him away. By the way, Randy Yellows of Republicans Overseas is with us. Thanks for joining us. Robert Parsons, you heard Kevin McCarthy effectively along the same lines of what we just heard from Gérald Olivier, saying, "Look, it's all because they lost the election in 2016. They haven't gotten over it."
Well, maybe that's part of it. But the fact of the matter, as we were just saying, is that he did apply political pressure, and the fact that he was the president makes what he did even worse. The fact that he is the president is the whole issue here.
Who else could do it? He's in charge of foreign policy.
The fact that the quid pro quo did not happen in the end is neither here nor there. At the time,
you're not going to make that phone call to President Zelensky. I'm so sorry,
at the time that he was making the suggestion, it wasn't clear to him that the quid pro quo wouldn't go through.
He may, of course he's going to have something in mind. You're talking about giving away American taxpayers' dollars to a foreign power.
But
to
it
have
been
that
approved
power.
by Congress.
Yeah, of course it's been approved by Congress.
As it had been in 2018 and 2017.
Yes, just
And
like it had been before.
And there's a
when Joe
Russian-backed
Biden went there
insurgency going
himself.
on at the same time inside of Ukraine.
The president of Ukraine got elected promising his people to fight corruption. And President Trump congratulates him on his elections
There
and
was
said,
no corruption
"You got to
here
stay
to
to your
fight.
word and fight corruption."
This was
And
something that Giuliani,
there's nothing
dreamed
beyond
up
that.
and used later on. I mean, there was. If we're going to talk about corruption around the world, there are so many places the United States
No,
gives
we don't
money,
need to go around
and
the
there's
world.
so
We can
much
stick to
corruption that's
Washington.
taken place. If you talk about the corruption that the president is supposedly fighting, there are so many other countries the United States gives money to. If he wanted to start fighting corruption, he could start in many places. There was no evidence of the corruption he's starting to fight with the Bidens.
Of course
that
there was.
should be linked
That's where
to
they
this
were
aid.
firing their own prosecutors over there.
I think there's
one by one.
Hunter
Randy
Biden,
Yellows.
Hunter Biden had very little to do with any of this.
No, but he made a lot of money out of it.
I've been following. I'm sorry, just came in the last minute. I just have a few comments to make. I think there's a major issue talking about the evidence in this case. I think you need to go back to the core of the issue of the impeachment procedure since the beginning and how the different hearings were held behind closed doors and how the entire situation dealing with the issues of due process in this case to mount this case against the president. The case is where there's impeachment, we have to establish what the different rights of different parties to be able to engage who are their various individuals who are involved.
So why did the White House choose not to cooperate?
That was already at the end. They didn't cooperate at the end. In the beginning, they didn't allow them to bring in their own witnesses, to have access to documents, to be able to cross-examine different witnesses at the different, not to have attorneys present at certain times.
I asked the question
doors.
because the second of those two, again, for our viewers here, just to explain, the second of those two articles of impeachment is obstruction of Congress.
I guess
Which is, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Stepping in because it's such a hot topic, which is preposterous. Meaning he's impeached for supposedly blocking an investigation
For
into an
blocking the
impeachment
process.
for which there is no basis.
You cannot,
article of impeachment is blocking
If you
an
can
impeachment.
imagine any trial in which the
doesn't
defendant
make
says,
sense.
"I'm not going to have a trial because I don't believe I should have a trial."
The procedure is
Under
biased. From the
then
beginning,
you
the
need
procedure
to
is
speak to the
biased.
It is.
Then speak to the founders of the U.S. Constitution.
No,
no,
They're
you're-
dead.
If-
What we
why don't you
have
have due
here
process since
is a
the beginning?
process in which Congress has the right to ask for evidence, and for every president up to this point. Congress has requested evidence, and the president has provided that evidence, even if that evidence is inculpatory. And in this particular instance, the president cannot say, I don't believe in this process, so therefore I'm not going to cooperate with it.
If I may, your first question, going back to the very beginning of this debate, was, are the Democrats going about the right way from a procedure angle? And in fact, if you look back at the Mueller investigation, yes, they were going about it the right way. They had suspicion of collusion. So you assign a special prosecutor, an independent prosecutor, to investigate the matter. You get his report. From his report, you have conclusions. From those conclusions, you get a commission together. You draw articles of impeachment.
So this is too hasty this time around.
Much too hasty. There was no investigation. The investigation was conducted by...
Build up the case.
Exactly.
But you have the White House saying they're going to cooperate once it goes to the Senate.
And why? Because the Senate is controlled by the flunkies of the president,
because they will have a chance to call their witness, which they haven't had.
A chief justice will preside over this proceeding, and a chief justice who is also among other Republican people who have supported the president and given expanded executive privilege to him.
Okay, I think what's important from the beginning, and I appreciate the input that we've had regarding the Mueller case, is if we had from the beginning a list of witnesses, access to the files, if we could cross-examine from the beginning and be able to have a proper investigation from the beginning. What happened is we had closed doors for 2/3 of the hearings, and the last one was public. Once they were able to build up some sort of a case against them, that's it, we're going to make it public. It was somewhat of a show. If it was a question of creating credibility for the cases, they did more in the Mueller report, which was much more equitable and a balanced and fair approach to give credibility to the entire impeachment procedure. The way it was done wasn't done fairly. If you just look at it from that angle, why is it today we're arguing along party lines? Because you find yourself in that situation because of that. If initially it was done on a more fair basis from the beginning, along guidelines that everybody had the same say, bring your own evidence, bring your own issues, bring in, again, cross-examine, have access to documents.
Right.
Then
let's listen to the charge of the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He's saying the problem is, and we've seen it already with some of the witnesses called, that there could be the potential to filibuster, to obstruct. Adam Schiff saying that charge of obstruction of Congress goes definitely beyond just the electoral motive to move fast.
The argument, why don't you just wait, amounts to this. Why don't you just let him cheat in one more election? Why not let him cheat just one more time? Why not let him have foreign help just one more time?
Randy Yellows?
Look, if they're acting as an investigative judge in this a prosecutor, they should have a more balanced approach. They're saying he's cheating already, and we're not been at trial level.
But that's the U.S. Constitution, right? It's the House that prosecutes, and it's the Senate that tries.
It is. That's why I said, if you have a problem with the Constitution,
if you go before a grand jury, it's the same thing in the grand jury. Present evidence from both sides in the grand jury.
Excuse me, if I may. This is like a child killing his parents and saying, please, I'm an orphan. These Republicans have, throughout this process, even prior to this, with U.S. Supreme Court nominees, with every aspect of what they consider to be a process for legislation, they have relied on a biased approach. They have voted along party lines. They have filibustered, they had stalled, and now they want to turn around and say in the one branch of government they do not control, that is not a fair process. It's so ridiculous and hypocritical, but they've been hypocrites from the very beginning.
Everything you said actually applies to the Democrats.
There is no filibustering on France 24, but there is a break, unfortunately. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we've seen the final articles of impeachment that have been put forth. They'll go to the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee sometime this week, and then a vote before the full House. By the end of next week, the Democrats who want to see that trial before the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate happen before Those primaries begin next month for the U.S. presidential elections. With us, Gloria Brown-Marshall, a professor at John Jay School of Criminal Justice and the author of The Voting Rights War. Welcome back. Sitting next to you, a Franco-American attorney, Randy Yallas of Republicans Overseas. Gérald Olivier, editor of the France Amérique blog, columnist for Atlantico.fr. Your forthcoming book again?
On the Sur la route de la Maison Blanche, it's in French. On the road to the White House.
On the road to the White House.
It's a dictionary of American elections, presidential elections.
Okay, all right. And with us as well, Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons. Rob, this happens to be the day the Russian foreign minister visits the White House. It's a little bit ironic. It's the first time since 2017 that Sergei Lavrov has been in town. It was the day after FBI Director James Comey had been fired. Lavrov coming off Monday's summit here in Paris, one that fell well short of a breakthrough to end a war on the common border between Russia and Ukraine, one that's claimed 13,000 lives. It's a little bit of an irony, this timing.
It is ironic. I mean, I guess they were talking primarily about the outcome of those talks yesterday in Paris involving Zelensky and Putin in particular, but also, of course, Macron and Angela Merkel. But ironic because of that meeting a couple of years ago when Donald Trump was there with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador, and nobody else except a journalist from TASS. There were a lot of questions asked about that at the time. Why should that have happened? And during the course of that meeting, Donald Trump revealed to Sergei Lavrov a threat from ISIS to airliners using portable laptop computers. The information, it turned out, had come from Israel, from an operative inside Syria, and by revealing it without the consent of Israel, there was discussion that maybe this was undermining the security of the operative in Syria. Donald Trump came under a lot of criticism at the time, part of an ongoing wave of criticism, in fact. But that's what that was about.
What are the optics? Because the impeachment, as you've heard, it's a fiery domestic debate for Americans. But what's the impact? Again, coming off that Paris conference, that Normandy format conference that was held here in Paris on Monday, what's the impact of impeachment on Ukrainians?
Well, until it happens, not very much. But if it were to happen, clearly it would be very significant. At the moment, the problem I think that Zelensky faces is that he desperately needs U.S. aid. He doesn't care, whether the president is a Republican or a Democrat. He's got to keep both sides happy in this equation. And the problem that is created for him by Donald Trump's approach is he's being sucked into partisan American politics. That's highly dangerous for Ukraine. He understands it very well, despite the fact that he's a pretty inexperienced politician and has been trying to keep some distance with a reasonable amount of success. But that is one of the dangers of what Donald Trump has been trying to do. That is part of the accusation of undermining national interest that is directed against him. Because the Ukraine is fighting, as you pointed out earlier on, a long-standing war against Russia by withdrawing or threatening to withdraw aid, whether or not it was part of a quid pro quo or not, or whether, as you argued, it was subsequently given back to the Ukrainians, approved by the president. The fact of the matter is, by raising it at a critical time, it sent a signal to Russia and it sent a signal to Ukraine that perhaps that aid is still in question.
All right, last week, Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, shrugged off the criticism, the potential even of criminal charges. He doubled down with a new visit to Ukraine, one that a former Ukrainian diplomat, who labels himself a conservative, crowed about on his Twitter feed, a trip that had the presidential seal of approval.
Well, I just know he came back from someplace and he's going to make a report, I think, to the Attorney General and to Congress. He says he has a lot of good information. I have not spoken to him about that information, but Rudy, as you know, has been one of the great crime fighters of the last 50 years. And he did get back from Europe just recently. And I know he has not told me what he's found, but I think he wants to go before Congress and say, and also to the Attorney General and the Department of Justice, I hear he's found plenty.
Again, we're talking about optics. Is it a great idea for Rudolph Giuliani to be back in Ukraine at this particular time?
At this point, I think Giuliani is, for the moment, acting, maybe seeking some evidence of certain issues. Well, bringing, if he has evidence that would be in the specific case have an influence on the case, he can bring it. If it's legitimate evidence that wasn't brought in to the issues, we don't know. You're asking someone, the investigations that are occurring, like I said, along party lines. So if no one has been able to seek and obtain certain evidence regarding the different issues that were raised in the inquiries that were done against Trump, and he brings along this new evidence.
But you heard the national security issues.
The national security issues are part of the issue now. Again, we get back to the major issue of, again, the separation of powers. You're talking about, we're getting to the major discussion of how foreign policy, and how it's being used. Where are the limits? Again, are we intervening? Again, and it's an issue. I don't say it's, and today we're arguing along party lines to say, but I think the key issue today, you have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch are fighting between each other. What are the limits of this foreign policy power? To what extent? And one is trying to control the other. And this is a fight regarding different branches of government, and it's going along party lines. Naturally, I think in each of these cases, whereas we can criticize the Democrats saying, well, they're trying to get proof, maybe Giuliani, from his point of view, is trying to accumulate evidence also that wasn't fairly provided in the case against Trump. So he's trying to collect evidence in favor of President Trump in that case. So I think you have to leave things open without judging things. And I think you have to keep things open-ended because in any case, there will be a trial before the Senate because we all know that it's going to be voted along party lines. And it's been the case for the last several months, and there's not going to be anything new.
But it's not just a matter of going down party lines. As a born and bred American, what really bothers me is watching the muddy water that President Trump decided to muddy himself. When he decided to write more executive orders than anyone else because he was legislating from the White House, he muddied the waters. He allowed his power to be extended. When he decided to hire Attorney General Barr because Attorney General Barr actually applied for the job by writing an article saying he wanted expanded privileges and powers of the White House. These muddy waters means that in the end, the Attorney General has been silent when he should have been very clear about what the policies and the laws should be under these circumstances. He said basically nothing. We now have an Inspector General's report in which the Attorney General has cherry-picked different parts of it to which he would agree and others he disagree. So it's not just about party lines. It's about what are the values, what is the policy, and what has historically been the policy under certain circumstances. And right now, we don't have a clear statement from the White House. It changes because, unfortunately, Trump has an issue with the truth. And he's been very untruthful for a very long time. And it could be because he's a businessman. And I give you that. He's a businessman. And in business, maybe he didn't know the Constitution meant he had limitations on his powers. But he's actually told the American people, he's told me via television, that he believes the president has no limits on his powers. And he fires people who disagree with him. So he's sending these messages. And if you wonder why it's their mixed messages, he mixed the message. He muddied the water. And now it's not just about party lines. It's about a country seeking a White House.
You're talking about truth. And lies.
Yes,
let me explain to
politics,
you. So it's going
yes.
to trial. So what's going to happen once we get before the Senate and there's a trial and they decide to vote against the impeachment, the articles of impeachment, then you'll say, that's the truth then. Will that be the truth for you? Will you continue saying that those I think that's also a major, that's a good point.
Let me ask you the question. Is the President of the United States does he have a special status? Because that has been the argument.
The special status, I think there's a question of special status is that we have to go along the lines of what the Constitution says. And naturally, the Constitution was done to give a certain amount of space for each branch of government to be able to do its different jobs. Simple.
He's lost in the courts when it comes, for instance, to releasing his tax returns so far. It's going to come up before the U.S. Supreme Court.
And the Emoluments Clause says that a U.S. president, no one in the federal government can take benefits from a foreign government. So I don't even understand if he knows what the constitutional limits are on his White House. That's the concern I have as an American citizen.
And I think when you as an American citizen also have the state to allow him to have the right, if he doesn't believe, if he has a specific point that he doesn't agree with, and it goes to court, he's going to fight specific things. Afterwards, the judge will decide yes or no. Then he'll need to comply with those things that the judge decides at one point. I think that you also have to leave. The same thing is regarding the impeachment, that what's going to happen when we reach the Senate level, once it's decided, the case should be closed. But
then should he have given over the documents and allowed the people to actually testify? How can you turn around and say there's not enough truth from his side when he did not allow people to testify?
You didn't allow him to have a due process regarding evidence. So
therefore, he's not going to participate in the process?
No, that's not the question. The question, I think, is the question of due process has to occur from the beginning. If you're deciding what the rules are from the beginning, and he's saying, where does he feel he's going to have a fair trial at one specific point?
So anyone who believes they're not going to have a fair trial cannot
but the question
participate.
is, you don't want to admit from the beginning. Why don't you go through the different stages of the impeachment procedure, of what occurred, and can you say to me...
The next step in that procedure, Gérald Olivier, and that's in your book, I suppose it's about the campaign, not about impeachment. But
well, the impeachment is in there.
but it is, you're going to have the senators acting as jurors, the Supreme Court will be judging
the Chief Justice.
The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will be the president of the court, and the senators will be acting as defense and accusation lawyers, basically. But there is always a but. The Senate may decide to dismiss the case,
or call other witnesses.
That they will. If there is a trial, they will. But when we said there's going to be a trial in front of the Senate, technically, yes, there should be. But the Senate has an option of simply dismissing the articles of impeachment, of considering that there is not enough evidence behind them, and simple majority rule, they dismiss the case. Like any court may dismiss the case. A judge may dismiss the case. That's not what Donald Trump wants. And to go back to why was Giuliani in Ukraine, yes, he was collecting evidence because, as I said earlier, Donald Trump hopes to turn the trial around and put Joe Biden and the system that was in before it got to the White House
President
on
Trump's
trial.
Own people said there was no evidence of Ukraine causing this disruption of the 2016.
We're not in a position to know.
Then why don't we just say
we're not involved in
the vice
We don't even know what happened
specifically. Plenty of evidence of the vice president taking his son on Air Force Two on a trip to Ukraine, and the son coming out with a seat on the board of administrators of a company.
President Trump to continue to act in this wayward manner.
Investigated.
That's a red herring.
It is very much a red herring.
I think it's a question that we're... Go ahead.
Let me just ask Gloria Brown-Marshall, if Republicans in the Senate do decide they want to call Joe Biden to the stand during that trial, should he attend?
Joe Biden, if he's called, he must attend. That's the way subpoena powers work. We'll see. We'll see. Because why turn around? Why should anyone else ever obey a subpoena? If the president and people, yes, you're shocked, but the president and his people can turn around and say, I don't want to obey the subpoena.
Do it, you say,
when the Republicans do it.
But you say, why should another do it?
No, because they've set a precedent. And this is a very scary precedent. For the president to not only disobey the subpoena, but tell other people in his White House to disobey a subpoena. The reason why Richard Nixon, we all know, decided that he was going to leave the presidency was because the U.S. Supreme Court ruled he had to turn over these tapes. At the very end, there were still Republicans who supported Richard Nixon. So however, he turned the tapes over. He obeyed the subpoena. What we have here is a president who said he's not going to obey the subpoena and he's not going to allow other people to testify.
You mentioned the case was going to go to the Supreme Court. Let's see what President Trump does.
We're talking about the taxes here.
Yeah, after the Supreme Court makes a decision. Same thing for the subpoenas. They are going to be fought along the lines of the courts, and that's what the courts are.
You're not the
branches of government.
No, the precedent is already set.
Executive,
the reason why you don't
legislative.
retry every case is because the Nixon case already said that a president must turn over the documents under subpoena, and that executive powers do not extend that far.
But it's a different Supreme Court now.
It doesn't matter the Supreme Court. All it matters is the precedent.
We saw with the Supreme Court in 2000 refusing to allow a recount of the presidential election, that it proved divisive, and there was a lot of bitterness that lingered for a long time after that. Whatever happens with those tax returns, which is not the issue at hand.
No, it's not.
But will that also be the same? It'll be the same kind of impact. Whatever they decide, it's going to be very divisive.
It's most probable that the court will rule in favor of Donald Trump, but it's not. It's not a given.
In what
not,
aspect?
For the tax returns, and will allow him not to release the tax return because there is no law that forces him to. It's just what you would call common law or what we call jurisprudence in French, which is just the
normal practice.
Yeah, exactly. There is no rule behind it forcing him to.
Actually, there is law. The states have passed laws.
No, there is no law.
The states have passed laws
You're deciding
that would
on the legislative
require
level
the
that it could be
tax returns be turned over.
decided upon the legislative branch is trying to decide things that are given based on the Constitution to the judicial branch.
Yes.
And if there are issues that are raised regarding the subpoena, the disclosure of tax statements, that belongs to the judges to decide. And then you just have to accept that.
If you
Why
listen
is it
to-
so difficult
You know,
to
it's-
accept that there
it's
can be a
so-
fight on
It's
issues?
very
Why do
interesting.
Democrats
If
think
you
that they have
listen
the
to
sole
the,
truth
It's not-
regarding what it should
What
apply?
I find
Because of because of the I'll ask you the
And you
question.
can, because
no, but here
oriented, you're going to say the
Randy
judges are
Ellis,
politically oriented.
Randy Ellis, because the Supreme Court is so much in the media spotlight, and you have these justices who are appointed for life, and they're appointed by presidents.
They're the judges. That's the way our system works.
But
And you must
nothing-
respect
But you know
that
what?
because
It's
that's
always
how
been
our
like this.
But
that's how our
excuse me,
constitutional
I actually-
system works.
I actually teach constitutional
Then you're not in
law.
America. Then don't go stay in America if you don't accept
I teach
that.
constitutional law. I am a trial attorney, and I'm hearing interpretations of the American system that are actually not accurate. And the reason why they're not accurate is because the U.S. Supreme Court can say that a particular federal law is unconstitutional. That gives the opportunity for the legislative branch to say, we're going to pass a law that is constitutional that will fall within the decision of or rule of the Supreme Court. It's not that once one body has decided, the other body has no chance to go back and
They'll
make
have to
any
go back
amendments.
to the table, but that's why they wait many times. Once you go further than that, and stating when there are issues that even they're not moot. There are certain cases where the courts will allow things to happen, like the issue of the disclosure, given that there's no specific ruling guard. Maybe at one point, if they reject it on the basis saying that it's just common practice, maybe they'll go back to one day to the legislature, will decide then to pass a law on disclosure at one point, but that's not the case
But
today.
you have state
you have
law
to let the system.
and you have
Right.
federal law, and state laws have been passed
But-
that do require
But
the
we're not in a
tax
federal
return.
system under the Constitution.
All right, so in any case-
yes, we are. I mean, there are state and federal law.
We
under the
have
Constitution.
consensus.
Both have their own
We have
powers.
consensus around the table on one aspect, which is the probable scenario, which is impeachment by Congress, by the lower house of Congress, and then the Senate, because you need that 2/3 majority, clearing the U.S. president. Should Donald Trump be impeached? A tracking poll by the website Real Clear Politics, well, it shows no major swing in public opinion since those impeachment hearings began. And again, we're running into, and this is a first, even though there have been impeachment procedures before in U.S. history, it's the first time it's run into an election cycle. The question now, you have to wonder at this point, and I'll put the question to Gloria Brown-Marshall, what kind of a campaign is it going to be?
Ugly. I think we can all agree on that.
Not at all.
And
But will
don't think
it
it's
just
gonna be
be
an
no?
ugly
But will on the
campaign.
campaign trail? Here's my question: will it be on the campaign trail, impeachment every day, or will there be other issues?
No, I think the major issue when it comes to impeachment is that no president has been removed from office. But there is, under impeachment, no president has been removed from office. The major question then becomes, is saying to the president of the United States, enough is enough, draw a line as far as what your behavior is. If you're a businessman and you don't know exactly how this government works, or you've not read the Constitution, you have to believe there are limits on your powers. I think there's going to be an argument made by Democrats, whoever of the 25 who are left running for office, that we have a president who has become very wild when it comes to power, and we're going to have a Democrat, whoever that may be, who is going to pay attention to the Constitution. So it's an indirect way to say that the president is not regarding the Constitution with respect. And this last point I want to make for this time period, is that the president's oath of office only says that he will support the Constitution. That's what it says in the U.S. Constitution, that he will support the Constitution. That is the oath of office. And that is what the main core is, that he is not supporting and respecting the Constitution.
So this issue over the Constitution is going to dominate.
It's
going to be the big issue on the campaign trail?
Not at all. Not at all. It's a loser on the Democratic side. It's a winner on Donald Trump's side.
How so?
Because in his meetings, he'll say two things. He'll say,
in his rallies.
In his rallies, he'll say, look at these dirty Democrats. They can't beat me at the voting booth, so they're trying to get rid of me by having an institutional coup d'etat. And that's what he'll call it.
That will energize his base, but will it give him enough votes to win the election?
Because he lost by 3 million votes.
Because his second argument will be, look at the results.
Works like that.
Look at the results. You may not like me, but are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And a bunch of Americans.
So he'll switch the conversation to the economy.
Yeah, there'll be two sides. He'll be making fun of the Democrats and of that whole process, and then he'll be celebrating his own successes. And he has a few to justify, and he is kind of a boastful person, right? So he'll be doing a great job doing that. And his base will be energized. And I think that the Democrats right now and the Democratic voters are confused. They're confused about where the party is going. They're confused about where the candidates are going. They're confused about what kind of America they want. And that's going to be a very tough campaign on the Democrats.
And on that, I will agree with you.
Yeah.
I will agree that the Democrats have had a very difficult time giving a soundbite on their beliefs, that they cannot set forth, this is what we believe in, this is what in the agenda. It's quite true. I agree with that. But, my concern is that you have this big tent idea when it comes to the Democrats, and they've been unable to say that this is our belief right here, this one line. But on the other side, the Republicans have been able to put forward that one line, but I don't know if that's the one that's best for the majority of people who say they're Republicans.
You mentioned Big Tent. In the past, the calculus was when you ran for president, you campaigned perhaps from an angle, but then when comes time for the general election, you try to win over as many moderates as possible. Yeah. What's a better strategy for the Democrats? Is it to tack to the left? Is it to tack to the center? Is it to try to regain that big tent, or to forget the big tent altogether?
They're going to have to go with the big tent. One of the reasons why Donald Trump is in office right now, one, he did not win election. He lost by 3 million votes. He was elected. He was elected by the.
He was elected. We have our electoral college system. That's the way it works. He's the president.
He is not the first president to be elected with fewer than the majority of the vote.
But stop saying that the majority of people actually won.
42% of the vote. 58% of Americans voted against Bill Clinton, 58 against him. He was the legitimate president, so is Donald Trump.
The Electoral College
Gloria
did not
Brown-Marshall.
put Bill Clinton in office.
So looking ahead to 2020.
But at the end of 2020, what we're looking at is a Democratic president. We're looking at a hard-fought election, and as I said, it's going to be ugly for a lot of different reasons.
So they're going to have to appeal to both the left and to the center.
And to the center. But one of the reasons why we have this Republican president right now is as a backlash to having President Barack Obama, a black president in the White House, and this identity crisis of a lot of Americans. Who are we in this nation? And I think that President Trump played on that as a candidate, and he played on. There's still a lot of people who want to make America great again by taking it back to the 1950s with limited rights of immigration, even though it's a country of immigrants, and limited rights of other people. Here's the last point, that the Democrats are going to have to, unfortunately, go center almost a little right. They cannot be as far left as they were before, because you see the backlash, and it's the moderates that the Republicans will lose, the moderates that the Democrats have to gain in order to win this election.
See, the problem here, and it's in your speech and in the way you present things. Yes, Democrats have a majority of the population behind them.
Very briefly, because we're almost out of time. Is it better for them to tack to the left or to the center?
They have to go to the center, and that's why Bloomberg came in. Because Biden won't get it.
It is, and that's why I said I agree. Right. They're going to have to go to the center.
And he's a former Republican, so he wants to grab some of the Republicans toward the center away from
Trump.
That's
next
part
debate.
of the strategy of the Democrats.
Prime the pump there. Many thanks, I want to thank as well Randy Yallis, Gloria Brown-Marshall, Robert Parsons. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.